The world has entered a dangerous moment. In the Caribbean Sea, a Venezuelan warship has collided with a U.S. Navy destroyer. It happened suddenly, a loud crash, waves rising, alarms blaring. But this was not just a simple accident between two ships. It was the sound of something much larger breaking, a symbol of how global power itself is shifting. For decades, the United States stood as the world's strongest power, and its navy ruled the seas without challenge. When an American warship sailed into any ocean, it represented authority, the idea that Washington decided what was right and what was wrong. But now, even that certainty is being tested. To many, the Venezuelan collision feels like a surprise. But in truth, this moment has been building for years through economic struggles, political pressure, and decades of resentment. This was not just a fight between two ships. It was a message shaped by history. In Washington, officials called it unprovoked aggression. In Caracas, the government called it defense of sovereignty. Two nations, two stories, one event that may change the century. But to understand why this happened, we must look deeper, not at the ocean but at the past. Latin America has long lived under the shadow of the United States. Since the 1800s, the U.S. has treated the Western Hemisphere as its backyard. It claimed this was to protect democracy and ensure stability. But behind those noble words was another truth: control. The Monroe Doctrine, written in 1823, declared that no European nation should interfere in the Americas, but over time it became a tool for Washington to interfere instead. From the invasion of Panama to coups in Guatemala and Chile, to economic pressure on Cuba and Venezuela, the pattern was clear. Whenever a Latin American country tried to walk its own path, it was punished, isolated, or overthrown. For many decades, this order went unchallenged. The U.S. had the money, the weapons, and the moral image to justify its power. But empires do not last forever. Slowly, that image began to fade. And so the Venezuelan ship, striking an American destroyer, is not random. It is the result of years of frustration, the anger of a people who feel ignored, sanctioned, and stripped of dignity. It is the physical expression of political exhaustion. Think about it. Two ships meet on the sea. One represents centuries of dominance, the other, decades of defiance. The crash is not just steel against steel. It is history colliding with the present. Across the world, leaders are watching closely. Some fear a new war. Others see it as a sign that the world is changing. Because this moment, this single collision speaks to something larger, the slow end of an age where one nation could rule the rest. Empires rarely fall in silence. They crumble in small moments, moments that seem isolated but reveal deep cracks. This may be one of those moments, a clash at sea that whispers a bigger truth. The old world order is breaking. The question now is simple, yet enormous. Will this be remembered as a brief accident, or as the spark that began a new chapter in history? To understand what happened in the Caribbean, we must first understand the long story behind it, a story of control, resistance, and pride. For almost 2 centuries, Latin America's destiny has been shaped not only by its own people, but by Washington's decisions. From the early 1900s to now, the United States has seen this region as part of its sphere, a place it could guide, influence, and sometimes command. It began with good words: freedom, democracy, partnership. But history shows something else. Those words often hid the truth of power. From Guatemala to Chile, from Panama to Cuba, the same pattern appeared again and again. A government would rise that wanted independence, that wanted to control its own oil, its own banks, its own policies. And each time the U.S. would act through coups, through sanctions, through covert operations, always in the name of protecting freedom. But freedom in that sense meant obedience. And nowhere did this pattern matter more than in Venezuela, because Venezuela was not just another country. It was a land of oil, one of the richest reserves in the world. For the United States, that oil meant energy security, wealth, and control over global prices. For Venezuela, it meant potential independence, if it could control its own resources. But when Hugo Chavez came to power in the late 1990s, the balance began to change. He spoke about liberation, equality, and the idea of Latin America rising together. He used the word Bolivarian, from Simón Bolívar, the man who dreamed of a free and united South America. Chávez's rise was not just about politics, it was about history trying to heal itself. For the poor in Venezuela, he represented dignity. For Washington, he represented danger. To the United States, Chávez's anti-imperialist speeches, his oil deals with China and Russia, and his rejection of the dollar-based system were seen as rebellion. Soon the economic pressure began, first quietly, then openly. Sanctions were placed, foreign assets were frozen, banks stopped doing business with Venezuela. The US government called it targeted measures against corruption, but to ordinary Venezuelans it felt like punishment for wanting independence. Their currency collapsed, shops emptied, hospitals ran out of medicine, and the world was told that Venezuela had failed. Few were told that its economy was being strangled by design. This slow suffocation lasted for years, and when people are cornered for too long, they don't just surrender, they resist. That is what led to today's moment. That is the deeper reason behind that clash at sea. A warship's collision is not just about navigation errors or aggression. It is a symbol of frustration, a desperate attempt to say we are still here. Think about how long this tension has been building. Since 1823, the Monroe Doctrine claimed this region for Washington's protection. For 200 years, that protection has meant interference, military, political, and economic. And now one small country is pushing back. Not with words, but with action. That's why the world is watching. Because it's not really about Venezuela versus the United States. It's about whether nations have the right to stand on their own, even when they are small, even when they are weak. The collision was only one moment, a spark on the surface of the sea, but beneath that surface lies a century of resentment. And once that resentment rises, no amount of power can easily suppress it again. This is not just a story of two ships, it is the story of history itself, trying to correct its course. When we look at Venezuela today, we see a nation under pressure, struggling with inflation, sanctions, and political isolation. But behind that struggle lies something deeper, a nation carrying a long shadow cast by history. For decades, Venezuela was not known for defiance. It was known for its oil. In the 20th century, its vast petroleum reserves made it one of the richest countries in Latin America. American companies built refineries there, foreign banks invested, and for a time it looked like Venezuela was shining. But that shine came at a cost. Most of the profits flowed outward, not into Venezuelan communities, but into foreign corporations. The wealth of the land never truly belonged to its people. It was managed by a small elite, often educated in Washington or London, who made sure that the country's politics never threatened foreign interests. This balance began to change when Hugo Chávez came to power. He spoke about giving the oil wealth back to the people. He nationalized industries, expanded social programs, and built alliances beyond the reach of Washington. To his supporters, he was a savior. To his critics, he was a dictator. To the United States, he was a problem that needed to be contained. After Chávez's death, his successor Nicolás Maduro inherited a nation under siege. Oil prices collapsed. Sanctions grew harsher. And slowly, Venezuela's economy was strangled. Washington said these sanctions were meant to restore democracy, but what they really did was cut Venezuela off from the world. The country couldn't access its own gold reserves abroad. It couldn't sell oil freely. Its companies couldn't use the global banking system. It became isolated, not through war, but through economics. And that's a kind of warfare too, silent, invisible, and devastating. When a nation is deprived of trade, when its economy is frozen, when its people can't buy medicine or food from abroad, anger builds, not just at home, but toward those who caused the suffering. It's this anger, this sense of humiliation, that shaped the moment when that Venezuelan warship struck the US destroyer. It wasn't about military power. Venezuela knows it can't match the US Navy. It was about sending a message: we will not bow forever. To the sailors aboard that Venezuelan ship, the act wasn't madness, it was pride. Pride born out of pain. For years they've watched their country portrayed as a failure, their government mocked, their people ridiculed as victims of corruption, and yet they endure, they survive. And deep down they carry a quiet fury that no foreign power can fully understand. In Washington, the event is viewed as aggression. In Caracas, it's viewed as redemption. Neither side fully sees the other's pain. But history tells us something simple. When dignity is denied for too long, defiance becomes inevitable. Venezuela's long shadow is not just about politics or oil, it's about identity. It's about a nation's right to make mistakes, to rise or fall on its own terms, without being treated as someone else's project. The United States once promised freedom to the world, but when freedom becomes conditional, when it only applies to those who agree with you, it loses meaning. The Venezuelan collision, then, is not a random act of hostility. It's the echo of a country saying, we exist, we have suffered enough, and we will decide our own path. That's why this moment matters, because it reminds the world that even nations under pressure, even those on their knees, still have a voice, and sometimes they shout through fire and steel to make it heard. The moment finally came on a quiet Caribbean morning. The sea was calm, the horizon endless, and two ships, one Venezuelan, one American, crossed paths. In that instant, decades of anger, frustration, and wounded pride met on the open water. Steel collided with steel, but what really collided that day were two histories, one of dominance and one of defiance. The U.S. destroyer was there under the banner of freedom of navigation. That phrase has always carried power. It means America's Navy can sail anywhere, anytime, to show the flag, to project strength. But to Venezuela, that same act was not freedom. It was intrusion. A reminder that even in its own waters, it was not free. When the Venezuelan warship rammed the American destroyer, it wasn't just a naval act. It was symbolic. It said, this sea is not yours alone. It said, we will not always move aside. The U.S. called it an unprovoked act of aggression. Caracas called it a defense of national sovereignty. In truth, both sides were trapped in their own truths, each convinced they were right, each blind to the other's reality. But under that collision lay something far more important, the breaking point of a system that no longer works. For years, Venezuela has been cornered, cut off from global trade, its economy collapsing under sanctions. Its oil exports have been blocked, its foreign accounts frozen. Every policy meant to punish its leaders ended up punishing its people. And yet, through all that pain, the idea of resistance never died. That's what erupted on the sea that morning, not military strategy but emotion. A deep, long-buried emotion of a nation tired of being told what it can and cannot do. If you look closer, you can see the tragedy behind the moment. The sailors on both sides, American and Venezuelan, are not enemies by nature. They are young, disciplined, and loyal. They follow orders written by people far away from that ocean, people in offices and meeting rooms who will never feel the spray of salt water or the weight of what they decide. For the Venezuelan captain, that morning was about dignity. He likely knew the risks, that his ship could be destroyed, that his action could spark war. But he did it anyway, because sometimes even a doomed gesture can mean freedom. For the American commander, it was duty to protect his vessel, to defend his flag, to show strength in the face of defiance. He too was doing what he believed was right, and that's what makes it so tragic. Neither man was evil. Both were trapped inside a story written long before they were born. The impact of that collision was more than physical. It sent waves through diplomacy, through markets, through the minds of leaders around the world. In Washington, it was seen as provocation. In Moscow and Beijing, it was seen as proof that the U.S. could be challenged. And in Latin America, it was seen as something even larger, a small victory for dignity, for pride, for voice. This is what breaking points look like. They don't come from one decision, one order, or one mistake. They come from years of silence, years of being ignored, until one moment, one act becomes the eruption of everything unsaid. That's what the collision at sea truly represents. It was not about power alone. It was about identity, respect, and history reaching its limit. And once that limit is crossed, nothing can go back to how it was. Because when the ocean calmed that day, the world was no longer the same. When the sea grew calm again, the sound of the collision still echoed far beyond the Caribbean. In Washington, anger mixed with confusion. How could a small, sanctioned nation like Venezuela dare to strike an American warship? How could this happen to the world's strongest navy? But perhaps the better question is not how, but why. The truth is that power without morality always creates rebellion. And America's moral authority, once its greatest strength, has been slowly fading. For much of the 20th century, the United States wasn't just powerful, it was respected. It claimed to defend democracy, freedom, and human rights. It helped rebuild Europe after World War II. It created the United Nations. It told the world it stood for justice. Even when it made mistakes, in Vietnam and Iraq, many still believed that deep down its intentions were noble. But over time that belief began to fade, because the same country that spoke of democracy also supported dictators when it suited its interests. The same nation that talked about human rights also imposed sanctions that starved civilians. The same government that said freedom for all punished countries that chose a different path. And when morality becomes selective, it becomes hollow. In Venezuela's case, this hypocrisy was painfully clear. Washington called its sanctions non-violent, but the effects were violent. Hospitals without medicine, children without food, people without hope. That is not freedom. That is slow destruction. The United States believed it was acting in defense of democracy, but to many around the world it looked like control, a superpower punishing those who dared to disobey. And when morality turns into control, legitimacy disappears. That's what this collision represents. It's not a contest of ships, it's a contest of moral credibility. Because when smaller nations begin to challenge a superpower, it's not just military power they're testing, it's moral power. Why would Venezuela, poor and isolated, risk everything to make a stand? Because when a nation feels stripped of dignity, fear disappears. When survival is already a daily battle, what more is there to lose? To the world, that act of defiance wasn't just about Venezuela. It was a symbol, a cry from the global South. From all those nations that have lived under economic or military pressure for decades, it was their way of saying enough. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous but also so meaningful, because the collapse of moral authority always leads to instability. Empires do not fall because they run out of weapons. They fall when people stop believing in what those weapons are supposed to defend. Once the sight of a U.S. flag on a warship meant order, now to some it means interference. Once the dollar was a symbol of safety, now it's a reminder of control. The world is changing, and this time the change is not being driven by armies or bombs, it's being driven by exhaustion. The global South is tired of being told what democracy should look like. They want a voice, not instructions. And in that sense, the Venezuelan collision is a message written on water, that moral authority cannot be maintained through fear or force, it can only exist through fairness. If the United States truly wants to lead again, it must remember what gave it power in the first place: trust, respect, and justice. Because power without morality is loud but empty, and morality without humility is just another form of arrogance. The question now is whether Washington still has the courage to remember what real leadership means. Because this moment, this single collision, might be the test of that courage. As the news of the collision spread, the world stopped to watch. In one morning, a quiet corner of the Caribbean became the center of global attention. Headlines flashed: Venezuelan warship strikes U.S. destroyer. Television studios filled with experts and politicians. Everyone had an opinion, yet few understood the deeper meaning. In Washington, meetings went late into the night. The Pentagon pushed for a show of strength: more ships, more patrols, more pressure. The State Department, worried about escalation, called for restraint. Intelligence agencies argued over whether the attack was deliberate or accidental. But beneath those official debates, something else was happening. A quiet realization that the world is not what it used to be. For decades, the United States shaped international order. It was the referee, the peacekeeper, the global policeman. If conflict erupted somewhere, Washington decided when to step in and when to stand back. That control is now slipping away. Even allies feel it. In Europe, reactions were divided. Some leaders echoed Washington's outrage, saying Venezuela must be punished for provocation. Others hesitated. They remembered Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and wondered if another confrontation was worth it. They feared that escalating could lead to something uncontrollable, something that would drain both resources and moral credibility. In Latin America, however, the mood was different. From Mexico City to Buenos Aires, television talk shows were filled with passionate debates. Even critics of Venezuela's government admitted feeling a strange pride, not pride in violence, but pride in defiance, pride that one of their own stood up to a power that had dominated them for generations. Ordinary citizens, long used to feeling invisible, suddenly felt seen. It wasn't about loving Venezuela's leadership, it was about something deeper: dignity. For once, Latin America wasn't taking orders, it was sending a message across the ocean. In Moscow and Beijing, the reaction was colder but strategic. Russia called for peace, but quietly celebrated the blow to U.S. prestige. China, calm as always, saw opportunity. Another chance to extend influence through trade, loans, and infrastructure, not bombs. Both understood something Washington often forgets: that power isn't only about military strength, it's also about patience. Each time the U.S. isolates another nation, someone else steps in to fill the gap. That's how empires erode, not through invasion, but through substitution. The more America punishes, the more others build alternatives. Meanwhile, inside the U.S., something stirred too. Many Americans began to question the endless cycle of intervention and sanction. They asked, why are we everywhere? Why do we keep fighting? At home, bridges crumble, healthcare costs rise, schools struggle, yet the defense budget grows. People feel tired, not of their country, but of its endless wars and its need to control every corner of the planet. It's a quiet fatigue, but a powerful one. Even soldiers feel it, pride mixed with exhaustion. For the first time in decades, Americans are beginning to see what others have long seen: that being powerful is not the same as being right, and that strength without purpose brings no peace. The Venezuelan incident didn't just shake the seas, it shook something deeper in the American mind. A sense that the old ways, dominance, sanctions, force, are no longer working. In many ways, this could be a turning point, a chance for reflection. Because every empire, when faced with resistance, must choose to double down and tighten control, or to pause, reflect, and adapt. History shows that only those who learn humility survive. Those who react with pride and fear eventually fall. The question now is, will the United States treat this as a lesson or as an insult? Will it reflect or retaliate? Because what comes next will not only shape Venezuela's future, it will shape the moral direction of the entire century. In the days after the collision, something unexpected began to happen across Latin America. People who had rarely agreed on politics suddenly found themselves sharing a common feeling, a quiet sense of pride. From Argentina to Mexico, from Colombia to Chile, news channels replayed the same moment: the Venezuelan ship confronting a U.S. destroyer. It was shocking, yes, but to many it was also symbolic. For generations, the region had lived in the long shadow of Washington. Now one of its own had looked that shadow in the eye. It wasn't about loving Venezuela's government. It wasn't about Nicolás Maduro or Hugo Chavez. It was about something deeper, a voice long silenced finally being heard. For centuries, Latin America has been described as the backyard of the United States. The phrase itself carries the weight of insult, as if an entire region's role was to serve, not to lead, to obey, not to choose. And for much of history that was true. American corporations owned the mines, the oil fields, the plantations. American military bases dotted the region. American diplomats decided which leaders stayed and which fell. Even its revolutions were shaped by outside hands. But this time, the reaction was different. It wasn't just government speaking, it was people. On social media, in streets, in cafes, ordinary citizens said what many had felt for years. We are tired of being treated like someone else's experiment. The Venezuelan collision gave voice to that fatigue. It reminded Latin America of its shared story, a story of struggle, interference, and unfinished independence, and the echo traveled far beyond the region. In Africa, leaders quietly smiled, remembering how their own countries were treated as zones of influence. In the Middle East, people compared Venezuela's sanctions to their own. In Asia, commentators wrote that this moment proved the Western era was slowly fading. Even in Europe, where loyalty to Washington runs deep, the mood was uncertain. Some nations wanted to show solidarity with the U.S., but others, worn down by endless wars and economic pressure, urged caution. They asked whether the West's habit of domination had gone too far, whether it was time to listen instead of lecture. This is what the Venezuelan act achieved, even unintentionally. It started a conversation about power and respect, about who gets to define freedom, and about whether the world should continue following one single model of order. But it's important to be clear, this isn't about celebrating confrontation. No one should romanticize a clash that could have led to death or war. It's about understanding why it happened and what it reveals about the world we live in. Because every act of defiance tells a story about injustice, and every reaction to that defiance reveals the truth of those in power. In the streets of Latin America, murals began to appear, not of war but of unity. Flags from different countries painted side by side, slogans calling for sovereignty, dignity, and peace. People didn't want conflict. They wanted recognition. For too long they had been told what democracy should look like, what economy they must follow, what alliances they should join. But democracy means choice, and choice means freedom, even if that freedom leads to disagreement. That's the heart of what this moment symbolizes. Not rebellion for its own sake, but independence of thought, a declaration that Latin America's destiny belongs to Latin Americans. And that message, simple yet powerful, has begun to echo far beyond the Americas. It is being heard in every place where people feel their fate is decided by others. It is the whisper that may soon become the world's new voice, that every nation, no matter how small, has the right to stand tall. The waves have calmed. The ships have drifted apart, but the echoes of that collision still ripple through the world, through headlines, through boardrooms, through the minds of leaders and citizens alike. The Venezuelan strike on a U.S. destroyer may seem like a small event in the vast ocean of global politics. Yet sometimes history turns not on grand speeches or major wars, but on quiet moments that reveal a deeper truth. This was one of those moments. The truth is simple, though painful. The world is changing. The age of one superpower defining the rules for everyone else is ending, and the era that is coming, uncertain, chaotic, but more equal, is beginning to take shape. For over 70 years, since the end of World War II, the United States has stood at the center of global power. It built the institutions, shaped the markets, and set the moral tone of the international order. The U.S. dollar ruled the economy. The U.S. Navy ruled the seas, and U.S. diplomacy ruled the narrative. But power, no matter how strong, always carries a cost. Over time, strength without empathy turns into arrogance, and arrogance breeds resistance. The Venezuelan act, that single moment of defiance, revealed that resistance is no longer rare. Across the world, countries once silent are now speaking, some through diplomacy, some through trade, and some, like Venezuela, through bold acts that risk everything. Russia and China are not merely watching, they are building. They see opportunity where Washington sees rebellion. Their message to the world is simple: there are other ways to survive, other systems to follow, and slowly nations are listening. The pillars that once held America's dominance, the dollar, the Navy, and its moral image, are being tested. Nations are trading in new currencies. The U.S. military, once feared, is now challenged even by smaller powers. And America's moral authority, once its greatest weapon, is fading under the weight of its own contradictions. But this doesn't have to be a story of collapse. It could be one of transformation. The United States can still lead, not by command, but by counsel, not through sanctions, but through cooperation, not by punishing others for their choices, but by listening to their reasons. Imagine a world where power means partnership, not dominance, where a U.S. president meets Latin American leaders not as superiors and subordinates, but as equals, where nations work together on shared problems, energy, poverty, climate, rather than competing for control. That is not weakness, that is wisdom. But to reach that point, pride must give way to humility, because history shows that empires do not die only from outside attack, they die from inside, when arrogance blinds them to reality. This is America's moment of choice, its crossroads. It can respond to Venezuela's act with anger, escalation, and more pressure, or it can pause, reflect, and rediscover the meaning of leadership. If it chooses anger, the world will harden against it. Allies will distance themselves. Rivals will grow bolder, and history will mark this event as the moment the old order broke for good. But if it chooses humility, if it talks instead of threatens, if it lifts instead of punishes, then this could become the beginning of renewal. A chance for the United States to lead not through fear, but through example. Because real power is not the ability to dominate others, it is the ability to inspire them. And real leadership is not about forcing obedience, it's about earning respect. As the sun sets over the Caribbean, the ocean seems calm again, but beneath that calm the world has changed. The waves that began with one collision will travel far, across continents, across ideologies, across time. What happens next will define not only Venezuela and the United States, but the moral direction of the entire century. Because history does not pause, it watches, it waits, and then it moves, and it always remembers who chose wisdom over pride.